Okay, today's share is dedicated as a zchus for Fuah Shalema, for Chaim Tzvi ben Tova Gittel, for Bracha Bas Vega Bela, and for Yehuda ben Vega Bela. Okay, so let's pick up from the Mishnah over here at the top of Tes Amud Aleph. The Mishnah says as follows: Ein choshesh in shemagir chulda. We're not concerned that maybe a weasel dragged it. Now, this is, of course, continuing the idea of bedikas chametz, that do we have to be concerned that a weasel dragged the chametz? And therefore, you're going to have to be suspicious. You have to be very concerned that that even after you do bedikas chametz, maybe chametz made its way back into the room. So the Mishnah says, no. Ein choshesh in shemagir chulda. You do not have to be concerned that maybe a weasel dragged the chametz, mibayis labayis, from one house to another house, umimakum lamakum, or from one place to another place, to imkain, because if there were concern that maybe a weasel dragged the chametz around from one place to another, mechatzer lechatzer me'ir le'ir, so then the same thing, you'd have to be concerned that the weasel dragged it from one chatzer to another, from one courtyard to another, or me'ir le'ir, from one city to another city, ein l'davar sof. And so there'll be no end to this. You'd always have to be concerned that maybe a weasel dragged the chametz from one place to another, taking it into a place that you already checked for chametz. So says the Gemara, wait a second. Time de lo chazina. This is specifically the reason for the din of the Mishnah, that you don't have to be concerned that a weasel dragged the chametz, is that we didn't see a weasel dragging the chametz. We didn't see it schlepping around chametz from one place to another. So time de lo chazina de shakal. It's specifically because we didn't see that a weasel took the chametz and was schlepping it around. Ha chazina de shakal. But if we would see that the weasel did indeed take the chametz, chashinan, then we would have to be concerned that maybe he went back into the house or the room that was already checked for chametz by bedika, and it would require bedika. That's the implications of the Mishnah. So says the Gemara, given our inference, v'mai, but why should that be? Nema achalte. Why don't we say that the weasel ate it? Why do we have to be concerned that it's just schlepping it around? Why wouldn't we say that the weasel took it and it ate it? Milo Tanan, after all, didn't we learn in a Mishnah that would indicate something similar? The Mishnah tells us, this is a Mishnah in the 18th parak of Aleph, the Mishnah says as follows: Maduras ha'akum, if you have the residences of a non-Jew, tameim, they are tamei. Now, what's going on in this Mishnah? So take a look at Rashi for a second. Rashi here fleshes out all the details of the Mishnah. Rashi explains, Milot Tanan, we now learn in the Mishnah in Maseches Alas, the following: Madursa of the Kuchavim, if you have these residences of the guy of non-Jews, Tamein, they are tamei. Why are they tamei? Because Gayim bury a stillborn baby in their houses. If they miscarry, so they bury the baby in the house itself. And we know that a guy contaminates, is able to transmit tama bimisasan, upon their death, af ba'ohel l'rabanan, even through tumas ohel, according to the Chachamim. So either way, the concern over here is that if you have a Jew who's moving into a new house, he just bought a house from a guy, he has to be concerned that there's tumah in the house, that there's a nafel that was buried in this house itself. So the Mishnah tells us, going back to the Gemara now, Milo Tanante, we now learn in the Mishnah in Alas, Madurso Akum, if you have the residence of a non-Jew, Tameim, they are tamei. In other words, there's a tumah of tumas oel that they bury their nafels in the house. V'kama yisha b'madar, and how long must he wait in the residence? V'yehei hamadar tzarich b'dika. In other words, how long does the guy have to have been there in order for us to be concerned that maybe there was a nafel that the guy buried? Arba yom, for 40 days. In other words, if a guy lived in the house for 40 days, then you have to be concerned. Ve'aful b'shein loish, and even if he is not married, even if he doesn't have a wife. Says Rashi, take a quick look. Rashi says, Kama Yisha, how long does he have to wait? Meaning, Kama Yisha ha'akum, how long must the guy have been there, b'madar, in this residence? V'yeh ha'madar tzarech b'dika, such that the residence would require bedika, once the guy leaves and now the Jew is moving into the house. So Rashi explains, Mem Yom, 40 days. What's the idea of 40 days? Kidei Yitziras Havlad, the amount of time it takes for the baby for the inception. And so, in order for a fetus to have been formed, and so that if there was a miscarriage of some sort, so then the the baby would be buried. And this is, of course, even if he doesn't have a wife, says Rashi, even if he doesn't have a wife living there with him, because there's concern that the guy engaged in znus. Okay, either way though, let's go back here. Milo Tanat, we not learn in Mishnah. Madursa akum tameim. V'kami yisha b'madar v'yehei amadar tzarich bedika. How long must the guy have been living in this residence in order to require bedika for the nafel? Arba'im yom, for a period of 40 days. V'afal b'shein lo isha, even if the guy does not have a wife. So the kol makom shechol del chazir. But, says the Mishnah, any place where there is a weasel or a pig, Yicholin lahaloch, able to go over there, Ein tzarich bedika. Any place, if you have a residence where it's possible for a weasel or a chazir to get in, there's no requirement for bedika. Why not? You don't have to check for the nafel. So explains Rashi, Kol makom she'ein chazir v'chol yicholin lahaloch ein tzarich bedika. So explains Rashi, she'im hushlach sham. For if a nafel had been thrown away over there, chatatu v'achalua, they would have picked after it in the ground and eaten it up. So what's the point of this? If you remember, the Gemara inferred from the Mishnah that the Mishnah is telling us that you don't have to be randomly concerned that maybe a weasel schlepped around chametz from one house to the other. But if you would have seen the weasel schlepping around chametz, then you have to be concerned and you have to go check in the rooms that had already been checked. So the Gemara has this question, and this is how it all started. The Gemara said, "V'amai, but why should this be nema achalte? Why don't we presume that the weasel ate the chametz? What would be the basis for such a thing? What would be precedent for this? The Mishnah, because the Mishnah tells us that normally you have to be concerned that that a guy buried a nafel that he had in the house, and so therefore, if a Jew's moving in, he has to do bedika unless there's chulda or a chazir over there, because then you can assume that the chulda or the chazir picked around the ground and ate the fetus. So why is it then that when it comes to the case in ahalas, we say that if there's a chulda floating around, you can presume that it ate whatever it is, that it ate the nafel, but when it comes to chametz, we do not presume that the chulda ate the chametz up. We presume that maybe the chulda just schlepped it around into the room that I just checked. So that's the question of the Gemara. So Amr of Zera, so Rav Zera explains, Lo kasha. There's really no difficulty over here. We have to distinguish between the case in alas and the case in Pesachim. Hababasar, this is with meat, with flesh. Habalechem, this is with bread. What does it help us? Bebasar lo meshaira. When it comes to flesh, when it comes to meat, the weasel is not going to leave over anything. Balechem meshaira. But when the weasel is eating bread, it is very possible that the weasel left over a little bit of bread. And so that's why in our Mishnah, even if we can assume a little bit that the weasel might have eaten the chametz, it's not going to have eaten everything up, as opposed to the case in alas, it will then not have left anything over. Okay, so that's Rav Zera's approach. Amar Rava, but Rava says, "Hi, my, what kind of business is this? What kind of difficulty is this? Bishlama hasam, over there I could understand, it's all good. Amar hava, Amar lo hava, because I might say maybe it was, maybe it wasn't there. Vim tim salamar hava, and even if there was an nafel there, Amar achalte, I can presume that maybe it ate it up. So in other words, over there, it's almost like there's a double suffix. I don't know if there actually was a nafel in the first place, but even if there was an nafel, maybe it ate it up. As opposed to over here, but over here, the vare chazina, the shak, we definitely saw that the weasel took chametz around. Miyamar da'chalte, would you say that it ate up? Have a suffix of vare. In this case, you would have a suffix versus a varai. Vein suffix motzimide varai, and we do not say that the suffix is able to undo the varai. What does this mean? So take a look at Rashi. Rashi explains over here. Hi, my Klumar. What does this really mean to say? So explains Rashi. My kushya. What's the difficulty here? Inema orcha de meshaira bebisra. If we say that the norm is that it's going to leave over meat, lekalan lemechash. There is no concern hasam midi at all. The hasam chashash ba'almuhu, over there it's just a chashash, a general chashash. Amar hava, Amar lo hava. Maybe it was there, maybe it wasn't. Hilkach hechad shchicha chulda, where there was a chulda that was a common found over there. Talin lakula, we can be mekel. Va'amrinan, and we would say im tibtzalamar hava, and even if it was there, Amar chalte. I would say that maybe it ate it up. V'safek achila yachal lahotzianu midei safek hashlacha, and the safek of achila is able to be motzi midei safek hashlacha. In other words, what are the two competing factors here? On the one hand, we have a concern. We're uncertain if the animal ate up the nafel. On the other hand, we have a safek if it actually did throw a nafel, if it cast a nafel, if it actually deposited a nafel in the on the premises. Aval hacha, but over here, gabi chametz, the kashalach. Our whole difficulty is heicha de chazina de gerra nami nemachati vadehu. That where we saw that it was dragging it around, well, we're suggesting that it was that it ate it. Vadehava, but this was vade over here. In other words, when it comes to the case in ahalas, what are we dealing with? In the case in ahalas, the competition over here is that number one, maybe is the nafel present? That's question number one. Two is, even if the nafel was present, the chulda ate it. Maybe the chulda ate it. That's the 2 points. Now, what are the alternatives? So we say that, well, I have a suffix if the nafel was present at all, and now I tell you, well, there's a suffix if the chulda ate it. So I'll tell you that good. If the nafel was present, the chulda ate it. So I have the competition is, on the one hand, I have a suffix if the nafel was there at all. I don't know if it is there, but I also have a suffix if the chulda ate it, and so therefore, and when it ate up the entire thing. As opposed to the case in Pesachim. In the case in Pesachim, I know vadai there was chametz, because I see the chulda schlepping around the chametz. I have a suffix if the chulda ate it. And so therefore I cannot say, well, when you know definitively that there was chametz, I cannot say, well, maybe the chulda ate it. That's not sufficient in halacha. But in the case in alas, I don't know if there was a nafel there at all, so therefore I can presume that maybe the chulda ate the nafel. And that's what Rashi is saying over here. Let's just read it again. Hi mai, klomar, my kushya. What's the difficulty over here? Inema orcha de meshaira bebistra. If you suggest that the way is that it leaves over a little bit of meat, even if you do say lekalon lamechash hasamidi, there's no concern for anything over there. The hasam chashash ba'amahu, it's just a concern, a general kind of concern. Emer hava, emer lo hava. Maybe it was there, maybe it wasn't there. Hilkach heichad shchicha chulda talin lakula. If there are chuldas, if there are weasels that frequent over there, so then we can be mekel. And we'll say the following: Imtim Salomar have that even if you say that it was there, Emar Chalte, I can presume that it ate it. V'safak achila yachalot tziyana midei safak hashlacha, and the suffix of whether the animal ate it or not is able to undermine the other suffix of it being there at all. Aval hacha, but over here, gabe chametz, with regard to the chametz, to kashalan lach. That you had the question, well, why don't we assume that it ate it? Vadehava. It was a case of vadai. So it says the Gemara, let's read it back in. Amarava Haimai. What kind of business is this? What's the difficulty here? Bishlama Hasam. Over there I could understand. Amar Hava, Amar Loa Hava. I don't know if the meat was there. I don't know if the nafel was deposited there at all. Vimtim Salamar Hava, and even if you say that it was there, Amar Chalte, maybe I can presume that the chulda ate it. But over here, we saw definitively that the animal, the weasel was schlepping around chametz. Who says that the animal ate the chametz? Can you in fact say such a thing? Have a suffix of vadai? You have a suffix that the animal ate it versus the vadai that we definitely saw that there was chametz. You cannot have one suffix undermining a vada. If you know definitively that there was chametz there, you cannot say, well, maybe the chametz was eaten up. So says the Gemara, wait a second. This is Rava's response. Remember, so now we have two responses here to this question. The question was, why can't we just assume that the weasel ate it? So Rav Zera says, well, it's because there's a difference between basar and lechem. For lechem, it might have left it over. So Rava says, who cares about leaving over, not leaving over? Over there, in the case in alas, there's a suffix. The suffix is maybe he deposited a nafel, maybe he didn't. Maybe the guy didn't deposit a nafel. So therefore, I could say, good, even if it was there, maybe a weasel ate it. But over here it's a case of Safik and Vade, and we say in Safik Motzimidi Vade. So says the Gemara has an interesting question. The Gemara says, is that really true? You're assuming that in Safek Motzi Midivadai? Ve'in Safek Motzi Midivadai, is that true? Is it true that we say in Safek Motzi Midivadai, that you cannot have a Safek undermining the pre-existing Vadai? V'atanya, I thought we learned in a Brisa indicates otherwise. What does the Brisa say? The Brisa says, Chaver Shemes. If you have a chaver, remember, he is the Orthodox, fully observant, meticulous about mitzvahs Jew, Shemes, who died, V'nich Magar Malaya pears, and he left over a granary that's filled with produce. V'afilu hein b'nei yomen, even if they were fresh off the they were fresh off the press, that they were just harvested that day, and they just underwent the processes that you do, the threshing and the winnowing, etc. So va'afilu hein b'nei yomen, even if they are fresh off the press, harein becheskas musukan, those fruits are becheskas misukan. What does that mean? That means that you can assume that they were misukan, that they were fixed up. In other words, that he took off Chumas and Maasros. Why can you assume that he took off Chumas and Maasros? You know that they were definitely tevel. You know that they were definitely threshed and harvested, and that they were harvested and threshed and processed to the point that they would require taking off Chumas and Maasros. But the Brisa tells us that you can assume that Chumas and Maasros were taken off. Why? But here, divided teveli hani peri, these peris were definitely tevel. They were definitely harvested and required having chumas and maasros taken off of them. V'safek musarin, and there's a suffix if they had chumas and maasros taken off. V'safek lo musarin, suffix if they weren't taken off, if chumas and maasros were not taken off, and even so, the kaasi suffix u'matzimi divadai. And a suffix can come, the suffix of whether the maasros were taken off can come and undermine the vade. There was a vade that they were tevel, but you can say, well, look, I know that they were definitely tevel at some point. I don't know if he took off maasros. I can assume that he took off maasros. How can I do that if Rav is right? So this is the Gemara's big question. You see from this Brisa that we say suffix is motzi midivade. So the Gemara says, no. One of two things. Either, number one, Hasam, over there it's a different story. Why is it a different story? Vadai vadaihu. You thought it was a suffix versus a suffix. Again, what's the suffix? Let's just keep track of this. In the case of the chaver shemes, I have what's the competition here? The Gemara assumes in our havamina, we assume that I have a suffix of mu'usar. I have a suffix if maasros were taken off versus a vadai. What was the vadai? The vadai is that they were definitely in the state of tevel. I don't know if he took off chumas and maasros, but we say, well, good. The suffix wins. You can assume that they had maasros taken off. So says Gemara, no, you messed this up. You thought it's a suffix versus a suffix. It's not a suffix. You thought it's a suffix versus a vadai. It's a suffix versus it's a vadai versus a vadai. Excuse me. So says Gemara, Hasan vadai vadai. It's a case of vadai versus a vadai. The vadai ma'asri, because the chaver definitely took off maasros. Why? Rav Chanina Choza, as Rav Chanina Choza said, Chazaka al chaver. There is a chazaka regarding a chaver. She'ein motzi mitachas yado davar she'ein mesukan. The nothing leaves his hand that does not have chumas and maasros taken off. So you say, well, there's a suffix if he took it off. This is not correct. There's no suffix if it was mu'usar. This is a vadai if it was mu'usar. It was a vadai that he took off maasros, and now you have a vadai versus a vadai. I know that it was definitely tevel, but I also know that he definitely took off chumas and maasros because he's a chaver, and there's no way that a chaver left this in his possession without having taken off chumas and maasros. That's what Chanina Chazal tells us. Okay, so that's one way out, and therefore you do not have any evidence to say that suffix is motzi midivadai. So says the Gemara, the Baisema. Alternatively, you could say that you thought the case was a suffix and a vadai. That's not true. Suffix. It's a suffix versus a suffix. Why? Because Dilma Meikara Amor Delot Tavili. Because maybe in the first place it wasn't even tevel from the get-go. Rav like Rav Oshia said. What's Rav Oshia's idea? Dam Rav Oshia. Rav Oshia has this idea. So a person can do a haram, he can do a shtick of some sort with his grain, and he can bring it into the house while it's still in its motes, while it's still in the chaff. So that the animal can be able to eat the grain, and that it should be pater from meiser. What's he saying? Well, we know that Rav Oshi tells us. Take a look at this Rashi over here for a quick second. Rashi explains. He gives us the whole background based on the Gemara Bava Metzia. Rashi says like this: V'bay sema safek saveku, ki heichi de misafkalan iasrinu iloasrinu. Just like we have a suffix if the fellow took off ma'asos or not, hachanami iklis fuki. There's still also suffix ichal alayu shem tevel me olam. We are mesupik. We're uncertain if there even was a state of tevel, elo or not. Umi kara amar lo tevel. And so originally it could be that there wasn't even a state. It didn't even have a state. It was never in a state of tevel. And even if they were mimurach, now what that means is like this. We know that when you harvest, so you start off first with a whole bunch of grain. You harvest it. So now you have it lying around in the silo. You thresh it. After you thresh it, you take it, you throw it up, you let the chaff fly away in the wind, and the kernels what remains. After you take all those kernels, you make a big pile out of the kernels, and you level off the top. When you smooth off the top, that's called memarech. This is a gemar malacha. This is the finishing activity as part of the trumas ma'asos, as part of the agricultural process of harvesting. And so, because of when there is a gemar malacha, when there's this terminating activity as part of this, the processing of the grain, that is what kicks in the state of tevel. That triggers a state of tevel, which kicks in the chiyuv of trumas and ma'asos, etc. So now what he's saying is, what Rashi is explaining over here, is that even though we do see that the pile was leveled off and therefore they were subject to trumas and ma'asos, still it might not have actually been subject to trumas and ma'asos. Why? Ubesocha bias. Because, and while it's in the house, but still, I might think, I can presume Avid Lahuk Rav Oshia. He did like what Rav Oshia's shtick is. What's Rav Oshia's shtick? Shechnisa labayis b'mochala, that he brought the grain into the house while the grain was still in its chaff. Va'acher kachdash, and then after it was in the house, he threshed it. Umemareach, and he does memareach. V'chovas hatevel chala b'reiyas pnei habayis. So the problem is that the chova of tevel kicks in only when it's viewing the pnei habayis. In other words, that when you bring it in the typical way, when the grain sees the opening of the house, in other words, you bring it in through the front door, that's what triggers when you have the that's what triggers the chiyuv trumas and ma'asos. That's what triggers the state of tevel. As we find in the Gemara Bava Metzia Socher, v'zeber reiyas pnei habayis lo nikmar malachtin. Well, this did not have a gemar malacha to trigger the state of tevel upon seeing the opening of the house, l'chol olav shem tevel, in order for the shem tevel to take effect on it. Ukeshagamar malachtan kevar b'socha bayis hava. And so when you finish the activity, when you did the gemar malacha, it already was in the b'socha bayis. It already is in the house. The ein elu pnei habayis ella kishenichnas derech pesachim. And of course, this whole idea of pnei habayis is only when you're bringing it into the typical routes to bring it into the house. Okay, so 1 second. So what's the point over here? The point is that you are suggesting that this was a vadei tevel. That's not necessarily true. It could very well be that this chaver did what like Rav Oshia suggested, that people would be ma'arim. They would do this harama. They would bring the grain into the house while it was still in its chaff, which means that this circumvents the whole chiyuv, the whole shem tevel. The shem tevel only kicks in if there's a gemar malacha that's followed by riyas pnei habayis, that's followed by the grain being brought into the entrance of the house. But if when you brought it into the house, it was still in its chaff, it did not undergo the gemar malacha until after it was in the house already, then that's a way to circumvent the tevel, the state of tevel, from ever taking effect. And which means then that if it never became vadei tevel, then you don't have a vadei versus a suffix, right? So this is the first teretz. The first teretz was what we said before, that you thought it was a suffix versus a vadei. No, it was a vadei versus a vadei because he is a chaver, right? That's what we said. Because as a chaver, he definitely took off trumas ma'asos. That's the first teretz. The second teretz is that no, you thought that it was a suffix if it was mu'usar versus a suffix, a vadei of tevel. Now we're saying, no, you were wrong about this. It's not a vadei, it was tevel, it's a suffix if it was tevel, because it could be that he did the harama of Rav Oshia. That's what the Gemara is saying. Dam Rav Oshia mariv adam al tevaso machnisa b'mot shala k'dei shadei behem tochelas upetura min ha'maiser. That's what's going on. Okay, so either way, where does this leave us? Remember, the whole thing got off the ground. The first part of the Gemara is just trying to say, well, why is it that why can't we assume that the weasel ate it? Even if we see the weasel schlepping around chametz, maybe it ate it. So we had two terutzim. The first response was Rav Zera. Rav Zera said, well, there's a difference between basar and lechem. And the second is Rava. Rava says, I don't really get the whole difficulty. Over there in Alas, I don't know if there was ever the vlad that was deposited in the ground, and so therefore I have a suffix if it was there in the first place. So good, I have a suffix if the animal ate it, so I can assume that maybe the animal ate it. But over here, I have a vada versus a suffix. The vada is that you definitely saw that there was chametz, that the weasel was schlepping around. You don't know if it ate it. You cannot say, well, maybe it ate it to undermine the vada. So now the Gemara had this question: is that really true? In Safik Motzimi Devade, is Rava's assumption correct that we do not say that a Safik can undermine the Vade? I thought the case of the Chavar Shemes indicates that we say that a Safik can undermine the Vade. So the Gemara says no. Either number one, that's not a good indication that Safik is Motzimi Devade, because it wasn't a case of Safik and Safik. It wasn't a Safik versus a Safik. It was a Vade versus a Vade. And the second explanation is that, no, you thought it was a case of suffix versus vade, it's really a suffix versus suffix. This is the second teretz. Okay, so says the Gemara, now that we've taken care of that question, the attempted proof to say that suffix is motzmi vade from this brisa, the Gemara says, well, wait a second, vein suffix motzmi vade, again, so now we have another attempted proof to show you that suffix can be motzmi vade. You're telling me suffix cannot undermine a vade? I'll tell you that a suffix can, from the following brisa. Tanya, I thought we learned a brisa. Rav Yehuda says the following. Here's the brisa. Amar Rav Yehuda. There was a story with a maidservant of a maidzik. What's a maidzik? So it says Rashi, a maidzik is an inish alama, very strong, fierce person, v'Yisrael hava, and he was a Jew. So there was a shivcha of this Jew, of this apparently powerful Jew. Berimon, in a place called Rimon, she hitila nefel labor, that she was depositing, casting a nefel into a bar. So she had Rahman al-San, some sort of a miscarriage perhaps, and she was depositing the nefel into a pit to discard it. Uba Kohen, and the Kohen came, hates its bow, and he peers into the pit. Now, says the Brisa, why does he do this? Leida im zacharu, to determine if the baby was a male, im nekevihi, or if the baby was a female. Why is he doing this? So Rashi explains over here, later im zachar im nekeva. Rashi explains, v'kohen karov omabnei habayis haya v'shalchu sham lahagad le'imo. And so they sent him over there to go tell the mother, mativa, what's the nature? V'tavchin, and she should be able to determine bein tumas v'taharis zachar limei tumas v'taharis nekevo, because we know that when a woman has a baby boy, she's tamei for a period. She's tamei for a period of 7 days, and then there's yemei toar of 33 days. But if she has a baby girl, she's tamei for 2 weeks, and then there's a yemei toar period of 66 days. So says the Brisa. So that's why the Kohen goes to check out if the fetus was a male or if it was a female. And this story came before the Chachamim, v'tiharuhu, and they declared him tahar. Now wait a second. Why would the Kohen potentially be tummy? Well, because if he's peering over the pit and he is ma'ahil, right? If you have this fetus that's inside of the pit down here, and the Kohen looks over the pit, so he will serve as an ohel. Here's my Kohen. If he's serving as an ohel over this pit, over the nefel, he will become tummy, right? He is serving as a roof over an ohel, so now he becomes tummy by means of tumas ohel. So the Chacham said, well, actually no, he is tahar. Why? Because there are weasels, and bardalus is another kind of rodent that are found over there, that are common over there. And in other words, the Kohen obviously didn't actually see anything. We just don't know if there was a nafel down there, and so it's a suffix if he was ma'ahil, if he served as an ol over the nafel. And so we said, well, no, the Chacham said that we can presume that a weasel or a bardalus dragged it away. Now, the way that Rashi explains this, the truth of the matter is, if you take a look at Rashi, Shechulda or Bardalus Mitzuin Sham, what Rashi says is Ustam Chor Chulda, and generally the whole of a weasel or Bardalus Posech Tavach Hu. It is a Posech Tavach V'Giruruhu L'Chorin, and they dragged it into the hole below a ha'ahil, and it did not, and the Kohen was not ma'ahil. In other words, what Rashi is saying is like this: normally, the way that Tumas Oel works is that if you have a person, I mean, there's two classic cases of tumas ohel. But if you have a person who is standing directly, or he's hovering over something that's tummy, let's say a mace, a corpse of some sort. So if he's directly over the mace, so then he becomes tummy. But the question is, what about if you put the mace in the ground, and now the mace is covered over with dirt? What about now? So there's something blocking it between the tumah and the person. But the answer is no. Even so, the tumah goes directly up and is matame that person. But, however, let's say you put the mace into some sort of coffin, and there's a cavity above the mace, and now the person is standing above this mace. So because there is a cavity of a tefach between the mace and the top, so there's this poseach tefach before it reaches this person, so the tumah does not go up. It does not penetrate beyond the poseach tefach. What's the area of tefach that is above the mace. And so what we are saying is that when the truth is there might be a nafel in this pit somewhere, but a weasel drags it into a hole, and that hole is going to have a poseach tefach. And because it has a poseach tefach in that hole, the tumah will not go up and will not be able to transmit tumah by means of tumas ohel. Okay, so either way, where are we going with this? Again, because the question of the Gemara that we're starting with right now is that true? Ein safek motzi vadai. I thought we have an indication from this brisa that you do say that a safek can undermine the vadai. How do you see this? Well, the Kohen goes in to check out. He goes to peer over the pit in order to see if there is a baby over there, to see if the baby's a zachar and a keva. The Chachamim say that the Kohen is tahar. He didn't see anything, but they say, well, he's tahar. You can assume that there is no nafel that's going to be able to be matami you. Why not? Because a chulda or bardalis dragged it into their little homes, and it's not going to be able to transmit tumah. So what do you see from this brisa though? But over here, in this brisa, the vada yetila, we know that the shivcha definitely deposited this nafel into the pit. This suffix geru, suffix lo geru, and the suffix is whether the weasel dragged it away or not. So suffix geru, suffix lo geru. Hayishait at that time. The ka'asi suffix umotzim vada, and now the suffix is coming and it's undermining the vada. Again, the way that we're mapping this out is that I have a vadai that the tumah was there, and this is versus the suffix of geru, that maybe the weasel dragged it away. I don't know if it would drag it away, but I know that I definitely know that the tumah was there in the first place. But even so, we are saying, well, you can assume that the weasel dragged away. So you see that the suffix is able to undermine the vadai, and this is a question against Rava. So again, so there's a big question. So says the Gemara. So how are we going to get out of this problem? So the Gemara says, Lo tema shehitila nefel bar. Don't say that the case is shehitila nefel bar. Remember, how did we read this case? Originally, the way that we have it from the brisa that we cited, it was Ma'isa b'shevchaso shel meitzak echad berimon shehitila nefel bar. She deposited this navel into the bar. So it says the Gemara, no, don't really say it like that. We have to amend this a little bit. Ela ema shehipila Kemin nefel bar. We don't know. We know that she deposited something in there, something came out, but it's something like a nefel that came out, but we don't know exactly what it was. In which case, v'have safek usafek. You have a suffix versus a suffix, right? So it's now, how are we answering the question? You thought that there was a vadai tumah. This is incorrect, right? This is an havmina. Now we're saying in the teretz, we're saying, no, really, there's a suffix. The suffix is if the tumah was there in the first place, and that suffix is versus a suffix of giruhu. That's what we're saying, right? You don't know if it dragged it away or not. So in this case of suffix versus suffix, then I could say, good, you don't know if the tumah was in the first place. Well, maybe the weasel dragged it away, so this suffix will win. So you don't have a suffix undermining a vada, you have a suffix undermining a suffix. So says the Gemara, what are you talking about? How can you amend the brisa that way? Vaha, but didn't the brisa say leida im zacharu im nekevehi? Ketani. Didn't the brisa say that why is the Kohen peering over the pit to determine if the nafel was a male or a female? So clearly there was a nafel there. So how can you tell me, well, something came out of her that was might have been a nafel or not? That's not the brisa seemed to say. So says the Gemara, no, I'll explain to you what the brisa is really saying. What the brisa meant was leida im ruach hipila im nafel apila. He was peering over to see what came out of her. If just air came out of her, or if a nafel came out of her. The im Timtzalomar nefel pila, and if you do say that, even if you say that a nefel came out of her, leda im zachu nekevihi, that he had to determine everything. We didn't know what came out of her, if there was just some sort of like a sac that came out of her body that had nothing in it. It was just filled with air. Or if a baby came out of her, and if a baby came out of her, then he would have to determine if the baby was a zach or nekeva. So again, the whole thing is a suffix. Alternatively, you could say it like this. Hasam, what was the first answer? The first answer was that, let's just revise the Bryce a little bit. We'll say that the case is a case of suffix usafik. Suffix if the tumah was there in the first place. That's the first answer. This was answer number 1. Answer number 2 that the Gemara is saying is, no, Ibai Seima, Hasam Vadei Uvadehu. Over there is really a case, not of suffix or suffix. You thought it was a suffix undermining a Vadei. It's not a suffix undermining a Vadei. It's a Vadei versus a Vadei. Why? Kivin the Chulda or Bartalis Mitzuin Sham, since there are weasels and Bartalises that you'll find over there, Vadei Geruhu by Hishaita, they definitely dragged away the Nafel. So, Nehi, Deshir Meshaira, Migra mias vade girum behishaita. In other words, that what we're saying now is you thought originally that there was vade yatoma there and a suffix of the weasel dragged it away. So the first teretz was, well, no, it wasn't a vade that there was a tumah there. Maybe there was tumah there. We don't know. The second teretz that the Gemara is giving right now is to say, well, no, you said correctly that there was a vade that there was tumah over there. She definitely deposited a tumah there. But you thought it was versus a suffix? No, there's a vadai that the weasel dragged it away. That's what we're saying right now. So says the Gemara, again, let's just read it in. So, by saying Mahasam vadai vadehu, really it was a vadai versus a vadai. To keep in the chulda bartlis mitzuinsham, since you have chulda and bartlis over there, vadai geruhu, they're so common, so frequent that they definitely dragged it away. So, vadagiru by hishaita. So, nehi deshir meshaira. Granted, they might leave stuff over. Migra mias vadagirum by hishaita. They definitely dragged it away. So, take a look at Rashi, who explains this point. And Rashi explains vadagiru. Of course, there is a little bit. It might be really Rashi's commenting on maybe the alternative gersa in the Gemara. Either way, what Rashi says over here is vadagiru muchzakin bekach. They are definitely muchzak, that we can rest assured that the weasel dragged it away. This is not comparable to the Mishnah. Dekatani hachazina, where we said, but if we saw the weasel schlepping around, that you'd have to be concerned that it dragged it into the house that you just checked. Chashinan, so dekatani hachazina chashina, where we said in the Mishnah, or we derived from the Mishnah, that if you would see the weasel schlepping around, you have to be concerned. Dinehi devade achla lo amar. That it might be true. We don't know that a vade ate anything, but we can say that a vade dragged it around, right? And so that's the answer. Is that the reason that it's different in this case than in our Mishnah? In our Mishnah, nehidishir meshaira, that maybe granted it leaves stuff over. Migra mias vade girum by hishaita. It definitely drags stuff around. In other words, I can assume that the animal vade dragged the bread away. Okay, the animal vade drags bread, and it also vade drags the nafel. But the difference is we don't know that the animal definitely ate anything. Okay. Either way, where does this bring us? Because remember, how does this all get off the ground? We originally started off the whole question by saying, why can't I assume that the weasel ate anything? So the answer, what happened in the Gemara, in the Mishnah in Alis? In the Mishnah in Alis, we do assume that the weasel ate the nafel, that the guy deposits in his house. So we had two terutzim. Either of Zer, we said there's a difference between meat and bread. Rava said, why are you bothering me with meat and bread? It's a case of suffix and vade. Ain't suffix motzimini vade. So the Gemara had a question, is that really true? The question of Ein Tzavik Matzim B'Davai. What about the case of Chavar Shemes? In the case of Chavar Shemes, you see that we do say that Tzavik is Matzim B'Davai. So the Gemara said either that's not a case of Tzavik Matzim B'Davai because it's a case of Vadai Uvadai, or it's because it's a case of Tzavik Tzavik. So then the Gemara had another question. What about the case of the Shifchaso? In the case of the Shivcha, that seems to indicate that you have a suffix undermining a vadai. So the Gemara says one of two terutzim. Either it's not really a vadai and a suffix and a vadai, it's a vadai and a vadai, or a suffix and a suffix. Those are the two terutzim. So now says the Gemara, wait a second. Umi amrinan. Do we say ein choshesh and shem gir chulda? Do we say such a thing? That we are not concerned that the chulda schlepped around the chametz? V'hakatani seifa. I thought the Mishnah goes on to say later on in the Masechta, in a daf or so, it says Masha Mashar. The Mishnah tells us whatever you have left, whatever chametz you have left in the house, make sure to put it away to stow it away in some enclosed place, so that you should not have to do another bedika. So what do you see? You're telling me that in general, so there seems to be a contradiction between the two Mishnahs. The Mishnah that we have in our Daf Tes, the Mishnah says, no reason to suspect, no reason to be concerned that maybe a chulda schlepped around chametz from one place to another and requiring you to do bedika all over again. The problem is that the Mishnah then, in a Daf from now, goes on to say that whatever you leave over, whatever chametz you have left, make sure to put it away in some closed cupboard, so that way you don't have to go searching around. So apparently, that would presumably be because we're nervous that maybe a chulda is going to schlep around the chametz. Well, which one is it? Are we concerned or not concerned? That's the Gemara's question. So the Gemara says, Amar Abai, Lokash, there's really no problem. Ha bar ba'asar, this one is on the 14th. Ha b'shlosha asar, this one's on the 13th. What's the difference? One Mishnah is discussing the 13th, one Mishnah is discussing the 14th. Bishlosha asar, and the 13th, the shchiach rifta b'kulubati, where there's a common, right, the shchiach rifta, that bread is found as common in all the houses. In other words, there's plenty of bread floating around in all these houses. Lo matzna, the weasel is not going to sit there stowing away bread. So, bar ba'asar, but on the 14th, but where there is on the 14th, where there isn't so much bread going to be floating around the houses anymore, mitna, there is concern that it's going to be stowing away bread. Take a look at Rashi just quickly. Rashi explains Bishlosha Asar. On the 13th, Reish Diktani, in the first Mishnah that discusses Ein Choshen and says that you don't have to be concerned, that's Babodik B'Shlosha Asar. That's talking about when you're doing Bedika on the 13th. Shematzai Pas Harbe L'Chulda B'Sochabatim, where there's plenty of bread around the houses for the weasels, Ve'ena Chosheshes L'Shire, and so the weasel is not so nervous to leave over bread, and so it's going to make sure it's going to eat up all the bread that it has. V'Seifa, but in the latter part, in other words, in the next Mishnah, Behedya Tanan Ba, B'Yadalid, it says explicitly the case is on the 14th. The kivin delo chazeh hachulda pas harbe b'batim. Since the weasel does not see so much bread floating around the houses, kemoshehi regila mishaira. It's going to make sure to leave over some bread. It's not going to eat up all the bread that it gets its hands on. And so that's why it is that we have to be choshe shemegir chulda when it comes to the 14th, but not on the 13th. So Amar Rava, Rava says back to Abaye, the ki chulda neviyahi. Is the Chulda a Nevi'ah? Now, this is a play on the fact that Chulda was actually the name of a woman who was a Nevi'ah, but the point is the weasel such a Nevi'ah, the Yada, the Ha'idna, or Beisar, that knows that right now it's the 14th, V'lo Afiyad L'Orta, and they're not going to be baking much until the night, Umashayr, and so it's going to make sure to leave over bread and Matamer and hide it away? That seems a little bit far-fetched. So Elam Rava, so rather Rava gives the following alternative suggestion. Rava says, Mash Mashayr Yanichanu Bitsina, whatever you leave over, when the Mishnah says whatever you leave over, whenever anything you have left from the chametz in the house, you have to leave it over Bitsina and put it away in a cupboard. Shema Tital Chulda B'Fanina, because maybe a Chulda will take it in front of us while we are there, and if a Chulda schleps around the chametz in front of us, we know what the problem is going to be. Then you're going to have to do a bedika all over again. And in fact, we have a brayso like this. Tanya Kavasi to Rava. We have a brayso supporting Rava. Harotza. The brayso says Harotza. Lechol chametz. If a person wants to eat chametz achar bedika, ketzad yasa. What should he do? Masha mashayir yanichen betzina. Whatever he has left, he should leave. He should put away and stow it away. Shalo tavo chulda v'tito b'fanenu v'hitzarach bedika achar. It says exactly what Rava said. It's going to require us to do a new bedika, so better make sure to put it away in some private little cupboard. Rav Mari says, Gezer Shem Yaniach Eser V'Yimitza Tisha. The reason that you have to stow it away in a cupboard and make sure that it doesn't is that it's not accessible, is to make sure that maybe we're nervous that you're going to find 9 pieces of bread instead of 10. And then if you find only 9, when you put 10 there, you only find 9, then you're going to be in trouble, because then you have really good reason to suspect that a chulda schlepped around the chametz. Okay, so that's this first piece of Gemara of the question of why don't we have to be nervous? Why can't we assume that the chulda ate up the chametz? Why don't we say or the idea of safek matzmi devadai? Okay, says the Gemara continuing on. Tisha tzibur and shamatzah v'achot chametz. What if you have 9 piles of matzah and 1 pile of chametz? V'asa chulda, And then vasa achbar, and a mouse comes, the shakal, and it takes from one of the piles. But we don't know if it took from the matzah pile or if it took from the chametz pile, which means that now there's possibly chametz floating around in one of the rooms that I just checked. So this is the case of Teisha Chanuyos. Now, what does this mean? This is the case of the 9 stores, of the 9 store shops. So take a look at Rashi. Rashi explains, this is the case of the 9 chanuyos. The kain malan behu, where we conclude regarding those cases, the kamei, the kol kavua, shenatul mimakom, kavuo, that anytime you have something that's fixed in place, that you took from the place that it was fixed in, ein holchem bo acharo, we do not follow the rove, ella harehu kemechza mechza, we treat it like it's a 50-50, v'safik isur l'chomer, and so therefore you're going to have to be, it's a case of safik isur, and you're going to have to be stringent. We'll get to this, Be'ezras Hashem. Pirish, so that's case 1. Case 1 is 9 piles of matzah, 1 pile of chametz, achra comes, you don't know which pile it came from, now you're in trouble. This is the case of Teisha Chanuyos, and you're going to have to be machmer. Now, pirish ve'asa achbar v'shakal, if it's separated, what's separated? So look at Rashi. Pirish prusa, if the piece of bread separated, me'achas minutrin, somehow one of the prusas made its way away from the piles. And then now it makes its way into one of the rooms, and then an achbar comes and it takes it. Hainu zeifa. Well, that's the seifa. Tetnan, as we learned in the Mishnah, Teisha Chanuyos, in the case of 9 stores, Kulan Mochen Basar Shchuta, if they are all selling 9, if 9 of them are selling kosher shechted meat, V'achas Mecheres Basar Nevel, one of them sells non-kosher meat. V'lakach me'achas man, and you bought from one of them, V'ni yodeh me'ezer men lakach, but you don't remember which one he bought from. Sfeiko aser. So then the savik would be aser, ubenimtza halech acharov. But when you just find it randomly lying around, you go after the rov. Meaning, if you yourself go to take away from one of the stores, then this is the case of kavua. The stores, there's definitely Isser here, because one of the stores is definitely selling Isser. You know that you took from one of them, and you don't know which one you took from. So this would be a case of kol kavua, kavua, where we say kol kavua kemechza mechzadami. So therefore we treat it like it's a 50-50. It could be you took it from the non-kosher store. It could be you didn't take it from the non-kosher store. And so therefore you have to be cautious. We assume that you took from the Isser. But if it's nimtza, if it's a case where it's just discovered, you find a piece of meat that's floating around, you don't know which store it came from, halech acharov, then you can follow the rov. Shnei tziburin. Now, what happens if you have 2 piles? One of the piles is matzah, one of the piles is chametz, and in front of them is 2 houses. And one of the houses is checked, one of the houses is not checked for chametz. And 2 mice came. Echad shakal matzah, one took the matzah, echad shakal chametz, one took the chametz. Vola yadinan hailahai aisle, and we don't know which mouse went into which house. Vahailahai aisle, and we don't know which house the other mouse went into. So in this case, again, we have the case is you have a pile of matzah, you have a pile of chametz, and now you have a house. You have 2 houses in front of you. You have one bias that's badak, that's already checked, and you have one house that's not checked. And you know that the mice came and they took from each of the piles and it went into one of these 2 houses. But you don't know which house it went into. It could be that the matzah made its way into the house that's not barak, and the chametz made its way into the house that's barak. Or it could be vice versa. You don't know. So says the Gemara, Hanushtei kupos. This is the same case as the 2 kupos, as the 2 boxes, the 2 containers. Tetnan, as we learned in the Mishnah, shtei kupos. If you have 2 boxes, achashul chulin v'achashul truma. One contains chulin, one contains truma. One's regular run-of-the-mill food that any Jew can eat, and one contains truma. V'lifneihem shnei sa'in, and in front of them are 2 sa'ah. 2 sa'ahs a certain volume. Echad shel chulin. 1 sa'ah is chulin. The echad shel truma. So this is essentially a similar idea, where you have a bunch of yeshiva guys standing in line to get breakfast. One breakfast is one container contains all the truma cereal, and one container contains all of the chulin cereal for anybody who's not a kohen in the yeshiva. And in front of them, we know that there is a bowl of cereal lying in front, and one of them contains truma, and one of the bowls contains chulin. and somehow, we don't know how it happened, but somehow the bowls were deposited back into the chulin. We know that one of them made its way into one of the original containers. We just don't know which one went into which. It could have been the chulin went into the chuma, and the chuma went into the chulin. You don't know which one. So it's the same idea as the chametz and the matzah. So what does the Mishnah tell us? So the halacha is again Ditnan, as we learn in this Mishnah, shteish kupos, achas shel chulin ve'achas shel chuma, lefnein shei son. In front of them are two sa, echad shel chulin. One sa'a is chulin, ve'echad shel chuma. One is a sa'a of chuma. V'naflu elu l'soch elu, and these ones fell into these ones. In other words, the bowls fell back into the original containers. Mutarin, it's mutter. Why are they mutter? Sha'ani omer, because I can say chulin l'soch chulin naflu. We can presume that the chulin fell into the chulin container. Uchuma l'soch chuma nafla, and the chuma fell into the chuma container. So therefore we say that's the same idea. Anymore Darmin and Sha'ani Omer, but wait a second. When do I say the idea of Sha'ani Omer? That was the concept that we were invoking, right? Sha'ani Omer, that I can assume that the chulin fell into the chulin, chuma to Anymore Darmin and Sha'ani Omer, bitruma derabanan. Maybe that's only for chuma, which is derabanan. Bechametz daraisa mi arminan. Would I say such a thing by chametz that you can just assume that the chametz went into the house? So in other words, what we're trying to say is over here is you can assume that the chametz went into the house that's not budak, and you can assume that the matzah went into the house that's budak. Just like for the chuma, I can assume that the bowl of chuma went back into the original container of chuma, and the chulin went back into the original container of chulin. So the Gemara says, why can you make such an assumption? Maybe I can only make assumptions when I'm dealing with chuma, which chuma meaning chuma b'zman hazeh, which is rabbinic, but for chametz, which is deraisa, you can't say such a thing. Says the Gemara, atu b'dikas chametz deraisa? Is b'dikas chametz deraisa? Derabanan hi. The whole concept of b'dikas chametz is derabanan. Because on the deraisa level, the only thing you really need to do is you just need to declare all of your chametz null and void. Okay, so either way, where does this leave us? We had a number of questions at the very end of the day over here, just to put it all together. Let's organize it a little bit. The first step over here in the Gemara was that we had. The first step starting from over here is we have the question of the chashash of gira chulda. That was what we said. And what we basically said is that we have the stira between the Mishnah in Alas versus the Mishnah in Pesachim. And the question is, how do you resolve that contradiction? So we have two suggestions in the Gemara. We have Rav Zera, who says, well, no, there's a major difference between Alas and Pesachim, and he says the difference is basar versus lechem. Right, that's what he says. Rava says you don't have to bother with this. Rava's answer is you don't have to distinguish between basar and lechem. The point is, one is a case of suffik and suffik, and one is a case of suffik versus vadai. Suffik versus vadai, I can't say that the suffik is going to undermine the suffik. The Gemara then goes on to say, is this really true? So the rest of the Gemara goes on to say, is that really true that ein suffik motzi midi vadai? And so the way that we do this is we have a number of cases to illustrate that, in fact, we say that suffik is motzi midi vadai. We gave a couple examples. One example was the case of chaver shemes. That seemed to be an example that you say suffik is motzi midi vadai, and the Gemara ultimately says, no, it's a case of vadai, or it's a case of suffik or suffik. The next case that the Gemara did this with is the case of shivcha. That was also specifically the case of shivcha, who is matal and nefel abar, right? So the case of nefel abar. And in that case, we say that, oh, good, in that case, you see that suffik is motzi midi vadai. So the Gemara said, no, it's not, either because it's a case of vadai, or it's a case of suffik or suffik. Ultimately, the Gemara says, wait a second. The next question was, are we actually concerned? Do we actually say that you're not concerned about Shemach Ger Cholda? So we have a stira. The next point is, we have another stira. The stira is between the Mishnah Pesachim over here, which is the Mishnah Pesachim Daf Tes, versus the Mishnah Pesachim Daf Yod. Because it sounds like you're not concerned Shema Ger Cholda, and now we're saying, and it sounds like later we are concerned. So we have two terusim of how to get out of that. Either Abayi's answer is, well, there's a difference between 13th versus 14th, and then you have Rava's teretz who says, no, it's totally different. They're really building off the same idea that maybe the chulda is going to drag away the chametz in front of you, and then you're going to have to do chametz. You're going to have to do a new bedika all over again. Then we have a couple of examples of where the chametz makes its way floating around. Starting off, we have 9 piles of matzah and 1 pile of chametz. In that case, when the mouse comes and takes it, so we say there's a case of kol kavua. This is like the case of tesha chanuyos. where you say that there's a difference between piresh versus if you actually bought from the stores and brought it away from there. The next case that we said is, what about if you have two piles, one was chametz and one was matzah, and in front of them are two houses. One of them is barak, one of them is not barak. So then we say that this is exactly the same idea as the shtei kupos. So the continuation of the Gemara goes on to discuss these cases of taruvos.